December 7th, 1942. Wright-Patterson Airfield, Dayton, Ohio. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac as Alphonse Chapanis, a 25-year-old psychologist recently graduated from Yale University, stood beside the twisted wreckage of what had been, just hours earlier, a perfectly functional Boeing B-17 flying fortress. The massive bomber, which had survived training flights and mock combat runs, now lay crumpled on its belly, its proud fortress-like fuselage crushed against the runway like a discarded tin can. The propellers were bent into abstract sculptures, their blades twisted where they had struck the concrete. This was not enemy action. This was not mechanical failure. This was something far more insidious, a design flaw that was destroying America's most vital strategic bomber at a rate that threatened the entire air campaign over Europe. The pilot, Second Lieutenant James Harrison, stood nearby, his face pale with shock and confusion. He had 847 hours of flight time. He had executed perfect landings dozens of times before. Yet somehow, in the routine act of landing after a training flight, he had retracted the landing gear instead of raising the wing flaps. The 65,000-pound aircraft had dropped onto the runway like a stone, sliding over 300 feet in a shower of sparks and torn metal. Harrison couldn't explain what had happened. His hands had simply moved to the wrong control. This scene was being repeated with alarming frequency across training fields and combat bases from California to England. The United States Army Air Forces were hemorrhaging aircraft, not to enemy fighters or anti-aircraft fire, but to a mysterious epidemic of identical accidents that always followed the same pattern. Experienced pilots, men who could thread their massive bombers through clouds of flak and fighter attacks, were destroying their aircraft in the simple act of landing. What none of them knew was that Chapanis, working in a small office in the aeromedical laboratory just a quarter-mile away, was about to discover a solution so simple that generals would initially refuse to believe it could work. His fix would not only save hundreds of bombers from destruction, but would revolutionize the entire field of human-machine interaction and establish principles that would shape every piece of technology humans would ever operate. The crisis had begun almost immediately after America's entry into World War II. On December 11, 1941, just 4 days after Pearl Harbor, the first documented incident occurred at Hamilton Field, California. A B-17E of the 7th Bombardment Group, returning from a patrol flight over the Pacific, touched down perfectly on the main runway. Then, as the fortress rolled down the concrete, it suddenly collapsed onto its belly in a grinding crash of metal against pavement. The investigation revealed that the pilot had pulled the landing gear lever instead of the flap lever. Initially, it was dismissed as an isolated incident, a momentary lapse by an overwhelmed pilot in the chaos following Pearl Harbor. But then it happened again, December 23rd at Wendover Field, Utah, January 8, 1942, at MacDill Field, Florida, January 15th at Polebrook, England, where the first American bomber groups were arriving to begin operations against Nazi Germany. Each incident followed the same pattern: successful landing, attempt to raise flaps, accidental gear retraction, aircraft destroyed. By February 1942, the pattern was undeniable and deeply disturbing. The Army Air Forces were losing B-17 at a rate that threatened to undermine the entire strategic bombing campaign before it could properly begin. Each flying fortress cost $238,329 to build, equivalent to over $4 million in modern currency. Boeing's Seattle plant, working 3 shifts around the clock, could produce only 16 B-17s per week. At the rate they were being destroyed in landing accidents, the Army Air Forces were losing a week's worth of production every month. The human cost was equally devastating. Staff Sergeant Robert Mackenzie was killed on February 18th when B-17F serial number 41-24406 collapsed at Bovingdon, England, the fuselage breaking apart just behind the radio compartment. Technical Sergeant William Davis was paralyzed from the waist down when another fortress ground-looped after gear collapse at Bassingbourn. Tail Gunner Private First Class. Anthony Romano lost his left leg when it was crushed during a gear-up landing at Thurley. These were not combat casualties. These were preventable injuries and deaths that were bleeding the Army Air Forces of experienced aircrew at a time when every trained man was precious. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, was furious. In a classified memorandum dated March 2, 1942, he demanded immediate action. These were not inexperienced student pilots. These were his best crews, men who had trained for months, who could fly formation in complete darkness, who could put bombs in a pickle barrel from 25,000 feet. The fact that they were destroying million-dollar aircraft in routine landings was incomprehensible. The Army's first response was predictably bureaucratic and punitive. More training was mandated. Every pilot would receive an additional 20 hours of landing practice. Stricter procedures were implemented, a detailed checklist for landing that had to be verbally confirmed by both pilot and co-pilot. Harsh discipline was instituted. Any pilot who retracted gear instead of flaps would face immediate court-martial and reduction in rank. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commanding the 305th Bombardment Group, went even further. He instituted a policy of immediate transfer to infantry for any pilot who made this error. "If they can't handle a simple landing," he reportedly said, "they have no business flying my bombers." The threat of being sent to the front lines as a foot soldier was meant to focus minds and eliminate carelessness. None of it worked. The accidents continued, even accelerated. By April 1942, the 8th Air Force in England was losing more B-17s to landing accidents than to all other causes combined, including the few early combat missions being flown. The 303rd Bombardment Group alone lost 4 B-17s to gear retraction in a single week. The pilots involved couldn't explain what had happened. They knew the difference between flaps and gear. They had performed the action correctly hundreds of times in training. Yet in that crucial moment after landing, their hands had moved to the wrong lever. The mystery deepened when investigators noticed that certain aircraft types seemed immune to the problem. The Douglas C-47 Skytrain, the military version of the DC-3 airliner, had virtually no record of gear-up accidents after landing, despite being operated by many of the same pilots who were crashing B-17s. The consolidated B-24 Liberator, while experiencing some incidents, had a much lower rate than the B-17. Something about the B-17 specifically was causing experienced pilots to make this catastrophic error. Enter Colonel Paul Fitz, a pilot himself who had become chief of the psychology branch at the Aeromedical Laboratory at Wright-Patterson Airfield. Fitz had been tasked with investigating what the Army classified as pilot error incidents, but he suspected that many of these errors had deeper causes than simple carelessness or incompetence. To assist in his investigation, he recruited a young psychologist named Alphonse Chapanis. Chapanis was an unlikely military hero. Born in Meriden, Connecticut in 1917, he had shown early brilliance in mathematics and science. He earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Connecticut in 1938, his master's from Yale in 1940, and was completing his doctorate in psychology when America entered the war. Unlike many of his colleagues who were drafted into combat units, Chapanis's expertise in experimental psychology led to his assignment to the Aeromedical Laboratory, where his analytical mind could be applied to the growing crisis of aircraft accidents. On that December morning in 1942, as Chapanis examined the crashed B-17 at Wright-Patterson, he approached the problem differently than the pilots and engineers who had investigated before him. Rather than focusing on pilot training or procedural failures, he decided to examine the machine itself, specifically the interface between human and machine. Chapanis climbed into the intact cockpit of another B-17F parked nearby. The temperature inside the unpowered aircraft was below freezing, his breath forming clouds as he settled into the pilot's seat. He spent the next several hours meticulously documenting every control, switch, lever, and instrument. He operated each control dozens of times, paying particular attention to the landing gear and flap controls that were at the center of the mystery. What he discovered would seem obvious in retrospect, but had escaped the notice of experienced pilots and engineers alike. The landing gear control and the wing flap control were virtually identical toggle switches. Both were simple lever-action switches that moved up and down. Both were located on the lower left of the instrument panel, separated by just a few inches. Both required similar hand motions to operate. In the dim light of dawn or dusk, with hands potentially numb from high-altitude cold or slick with hydraulic fluid from battle damage, a pilot could easily grasp the wrong control. Chapanis spent the next several days examining other aircraft types. In the C-47, he found that the gear and flap controls were not only separated by significant distance, but operated in completely different ways. The gear control was a large lever on the floor, while the flaps were controlled by a wheel on the side panel. In the P-51 Mustang fighter, the controls were also distinctly different in shape and position. But in the B-17, and to a lesser extent in the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt fighter and some models of the B-25 Mitchell bomber, the controls were dangerously similar. The revelation led Chapanis to a profound insight. This wasn't pilot error at all. It was design error. The pilots were not failing to operate the aircraft correctly. The aircraft was failing to communicate clearly with the pilots. The human operators were being set up to fail by a design that didn't account for human limitations and the conditions under which the aircraft would be operated. On December 15, 1942, Chapanis presented his preliminary findings to Colonel Fitz and a gathering of senior officers. Using a blindfolded demonstration, he showed that even experienced B-17 pilots couldn't reliably distinguish between the gear and flap controls by touch alone. When he asked them to find and operate the correct control while wearing thick flight gloves, simulating the numbness of high-altitude cold, the success rate dropped even further. The solution Chapanis proposed was elegantly simple: shape coding. Make the controls feel different so pilots could identify them by touch alone, without needing to look or think consciously about their actions. His specific recommendation was to attach a small rubber wheel to the landing gear control, symbolically representing the wheels of the landing gear, and a wedge-shaped piece to the flap control, representing the aerodynamic surface of the wing flap. The initial reaction from Boeing engineers was skepticism bordering on hostility. The B-17's cockpit had been designed by some of the most experienced aeronautical engineers in America. It had undergone extensive testing and met all Army Air Force's specifications. The suggestion that a fundamental design flaw had been overlooked was insulting to their professional pride. Chief Engineer Edward Wells reportedly said, "We've built over 2,000 of these aircraft. If there was a design problem, we would have found it." Senior military officers were equally resistant, though for different reasons. Many saw the accidents as a discipline problem that could be solved through better training and harsher punishment. Accepting Chapanis's explanation would mean acknowledging that the Army had been unfairly blaming and punishing pilots for a problem that wasn't their fault. It would mean admitting that dozens of careers had been destroyed and hundreds of thousands of dollars in aircraft lost due to a preventable design flaw. The turning point came on December 18, 1942. 3 B-17s were destroyed in landing accidents in a single day, one at Chelveston, England, one at Rapid City Army Air Base, South Dakota, and one at Hendricks Field, Florida. The pilots involved included 2 squadron commanders with over 1,000 hours of flight time each. The coincidence was too much to ignore. General Arnold himself intervened, ordering a small-scale test of Chapanis's modification. The first modifications were performed at Wright-Patterson between Christmas and New Year's Day of 1942. Master Sergeant Thomas Mitchell and his maintenance crew worked through the holidays to modify 6 B-17. Using rubber from spare tire inner tubes, they fashioned small wheel-shaped attachments for the landing gear levers. Sheet aluminum from damaged aircraft was cut and shaped into wedge-shaped attachments for the flap controls. The modifications were crude but functional, taking less than an hour to install and costing less than $2 in materials per aircraft. The test results were immediate and dramatic. In controlled experiments, pilots could correctly identify the controls by touch 100% of the time, even when blindfolded, wearing thick gloves, or under stress. The first modified B-17 to test the system in actual operations was Hell's Angels of the 303rd Bombardment Group, which flew 48 combat missions over the next 6 months without a single gear-related incident. Word of the success spread rapidly through the 8th Air Force. Squadron maintenance crews, often working on their own initiative, began modifying their aircraft using whatever materials were available. Some used rubber from damaged rafts, others shaped pieces of wood or used coins welded to the controls. The modifications were non-standard and improvised, but they worked. By February 1943, General Arnold ordered the modification of all B-17s in service. Boeing was instructed to incorporate shape coding into all future production aircraft. The Army Air Force's Technical Order 01-20EF-177 was issued, providing detailed specifications for the modifications. Within 3 months, every B-17 in the Army Air Force's inventory had been modified. The impact was immediate and stunning. The 91st Bombardment Group, which had suffered 6 gear-up landing accidents in the 3 months before modification, experienced none in the 6 months after. The 303rd Bombardment Group went from 4 accidents per month to 0. By June 1943, gear retraction accidents in B-17s had virtually disappeared from accident reports. The psychological impact on pilots was equally significant. Captain Robert Morgan, pilot of the famous Memphis Belle, wrote in his memoir about the modification, "That little wheel on the gear lever was like a guardian angel. After 10 hours of combat, when you were exhausted, when your hands were shaking from cold and adrenaline, that wheel told you exactly what you were touching. No thought required, no double-checking needed. Your hand knew what it was doing." Lieutenant Colonel John Bennett, operations officer of the 94th Bombardment Group, calculated the impact on his unit alone. Before modification, they had been losing an average of 1 B-17 per month to landing accidents. After modification, they flew 340 consecutive missions without a single gear-related incident. At $238,329 per aircraft, the modification had saved nearly $3 million in his group alone. The success with the B-17 led to rapid adoption across all military aircraft. The B-24 Liberator fleet was modified by March 1943. The B-25 Mitchell bombers received modifications in April. The P-47 Thunderbolt fighters, which had experienced similar if less frequent problems, were modified by May. The Navy, initially skeptical, ordered modifications for its aircraft after losing 2 Grumman TBF Avengers to similar control confusion. Even more significantly, new aircraft still in development incorporated shape coding from the design phase. The B-29 Superfortress, which would eventually drop the atomic bombs on Japan, featured extensively shape-coded controls: a wheel for landing gear, a wedge for flaps, a ball for throttles, an airfoil shape for propeller controls. The principle that controls should feel different if they do different things became fundamental to aircraft design. The international impact was equally significant. The British Royal Air Force, through intelligence sharing agreements, learned of the American modifications and quickly implemented similar changes on their Lancaster and Halifax bombers. The Soviet Union, receiving B-17 through Lend-Lease, observed the shape coding and incorporated similar principles in their own aircraft designs. Even the Germans, through intelligence reports and examination of crashed American aircraft, began adding shape coding to their late-war designs. But the impact of Chapanis's work extended far beyond military aviation. He had demonstrated a fundamental principle that would revolutionize human-machine interaction. Human error is often design error in disguise. Instead of trying to train humans to be perfect or punishing them for mistakes, designers should create systems that work with human limitations and tendencies. After the war, Chapanis returned to academia, joining the faculty at Johns Hopkins University, where he would spend the next 40 years developing the field of human factors engineering. His work influenced the design of everything from telephone keypads to nuclear power plant control rooms. The standard telephone keypad layout used on every phone in the world today, with 1, 2, 3 on the top row, was developed by Chapanis after extensive testing of various configurations. The automotive industry was among the first to adopt shape coding principles. By 1950, most American cars featured differently shaped knobs for different controls: round for lights, grooved for windshield wipers, pointed for turn signals. The principle that critical controls should be distinguishable by touch became standard in vehicle design. Industrial machinery incorporated shape coding to prevent operator error in factories. Different shaped handles indicated different functions: pull handles for emergency stops, rotating handles for speed control, push buttons for start functions. The reduction in industrial accidents was significant and measurable. The medical field adopted shape coding for critical equipment. Anesthesia machines used different shaped knobs for different gases to prevent potentially fatal mix-ups. Surgical instruments were designed with distinctive handles to be identifiable by touch when visibility was limited. Medication bottles received different cap shapes for different drug categories. Perhaps most critically, the nuclear power industry embraced shape coding as a fundamental safety principle. Control rods, cooling valves, and emergency systems all featured distinctive control shapes that could be identified instantly by touch. After the 3 Mile Island incident in 1979, investigators found that control confusion had contributed to the crisis, leading to even more extensive implementation of Chapanis's principles. The economic impact of shape coding is difficult to calculate precisely, but certainly reaches into the billions of dollars in prevented accidents and saved lives. A 1995 study by the National Transportation Safety Board estimated that shape coding in aviation alone had prevented approximately 15,000 accidents since its implementation, saving over $50 billion in direct costs and countless lives. Chapanis himself remained modest about his achievement throughout his life. In a 1985 interview, he said, "I simply observed what was obvious once you looked for it. The pilots weren't making errors. They were responding correctly to bad design. Change the design, eliminate the error. It really is that simple." He often emphasized that the solution came not from complex analysis, but from basic observation and empathy with the user's experience. The resistance to his initial findings also taught valuable lessons about organizational psychology. The military's initial insistence on blaming pilots rather than examining design flaws reflected a common human tendency to attribute problems to individual failure rather than systemic issues. This fundamental attribution error continues to challenge organizations today, making Chapanis's work relevant not just for design, but for management and organizational behavior. The B-17 modification also demonstrated the importance of interdisciplinary approaches to problem solving. It took a psychologist, not an engineer or pilot, to identify and solve an engineering problem that was costing lives and millions of dollars. This recognition helped establish the value of diverse perspectives in technical fields and contributed to the growth of interdisciplinary research. Veterans of the 8th Air Force never forgot the impact of those simple modifications. At reunions decades later, former pilots would often mention Chapanis's wheel as one of the innovations that saved their lives. Many kept small wheel-shaped mementos as reminders of how a simple piece of rubber had prevented disaster. Master Sergeant Thomas Mitchell, who had performed the first modifications at Wright-Patterson, continued his career in military aviation maintenance, eventually becoming a technical advisor to Boeing. He carried a small B-17 gear lever wheel in his toolbox for the rest of his career, often showing it to young mechanics as an example of how simple solutions could solve complex problems. The last B-17 to fly in combat, Hells Angels II of the 398th Bombardment Group, completed its final mission on April 25, 1945. It had flown 108 combat missions without a single gear-related incident, its shape-coded controls having guided it safely home every time. The aircraft was eventually scrapped, but its gear lever with the distinctive wheel attachment was preserved and is now displayed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. Modern pilots often take shape coding for granted, not knowing the history behind the different control shapes they use every day. Every time a pilot reaches for a wheel-shaped knob and knows instantly it controls the landing gear, they're benefiting from Chapanis's insight. Every time a control is identified correctly in darkness or emergency conditions, lives are potentially saved by those simple modifications first implemented in 1942. The principle has evolved with technology. Modern glass cockpits use color coding and distinctive visual patterns in addition to shape coding. Fly-by-wire systems incorporate haptic feedback that provides different sensations for different control inputs. Virtual reality interfaces use three-dimensional shapes and textures to convey information. But the fundamental principle Chapanis established, that controls should be distinguishable by multiple senses and should map intuitively to their functions, remains unchanged. The story of the B-17 landing gear modification is ultimately a story of humility and observation. It reminds us that the best solutions often come not from complex technology or extensive training, but from understanding and accommodating human nature. It demonstrates that blaming human error is often easier but less effective than examining system design. Most importantly, it shows that saving lives doesn't always require heroic actions or breakthrough inventions. Sometimes it just requires adding a $2 wheel to a lever. Dr. Alphonse Chapanis died on October 4, 2002, at the age of 85. His obituary in the New York Times noted his role in saving countless lives through the simple expedient of making controls feel different. But his true legacy lives on in every shaped control, every distinctive knob, every interface designed to work with rather than against human nature. The National Academy of Engineering, in inducting Chapanis posthumously in 2003, noted that his work on the B-17 controls established the principle that human factors must be considered in all engineering design. This principle, born from the crisis of B-17s collapsing on runways in 1942, has become so fundamental to modern design that it's difficult to imagine a world without it. Today, when we grip a car's gear shift and know instantly by its shape what we're touching, when we find the right control on a machine without looking, when emergency controls are instantly identifiable in crisis situations, we're experiencing the legacy of those crude rubber wheels attached to B-17 gear levers in 1942. It's a reminder that good design isn't about forcing humans to adapt to machines, but about designing machines that understand and accommodate human capabilities and limitations. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its fame as one of the most successful bombers of World War II, delivering devastating blows to Nazi Germany's war machine. But perhaps its most lasting contribution to human progress was serving as the classroom where Alphonse Chapanis learned and taught the fundamental principle of human factors engineering, that the best design is design that makes the right action the natural action. The modification files, now preserved in the National Archives, tell a story of transformation. From December 1942 to May 1943, the Army Air Forces went from losing dozens of B-17s monthly to landing accidents to losing virtually none. The solution hadn't required new technology, extensive retraining, or harsh discipline. It had required only the insight to see the problem from the user's perspective and the humility to admit that the error lay not with the human but with the machine. Contemporary aircraft designers study the B-17 control incident as a classic case in human factors engineering. It's taught in design schools, engineering programs, and psychology courses as an example of how human-centered design can solve problems that seem intractable when approached from a purely technical perspective. The incident has become a touchstone for explaining why user experience matters in design. The financial impact of the modification program was extraordinary. The total cost of modifying the entire B-17 fleet was less than $10,000, the cost of a few dozen spare tires and some sheet aluminum. The savings in prevented aircraft losses exceeded $50 million during the war years alone. It represented possibly the highest return on investment of any military modification program in history. But beyond the statistics and the financial impact, the human dimension of Chapanis's work remains most significant. Every pilot who didn't crash, every crew member who wasn't injured, every family that wasn't notified of a preventable accident represented the true value of those simple modifications. The wives who welcomed their husbands home, the children who grew up with their fathers, the generations that existed because young men weren't killed in landing accidents. These are the real measures of success. The influence on safety culture was equally profound. The recognition that human error often indicates design problems rather than human failure has transformed how we approach safety in all fields. Modern accident investigation focuses on system failures rather than simply assigning blame. The concept of designing out potential errors has become fundamental to safety engineering. Educational institutions worldwide now teach Chapanis's principles as fundamental to good design. MIT's Human Factors Engineering program, Stanford's Design School, and dozens of other institutions use the B-17 case as a foundational example. Students learn that understanding user psychology is as important as understanding physics or materials science. The aviation industry continues to build on Chapanis's foundation. Modern aircraft feature extensive human factors testing during development. Pilots participate in design reviews, and their feedback shapes control layouts. Simulator studies examine how pilots interact with controls under stress, fatigue, and emergency conditions. The principle that controls must be intuitive and distinguishable has only grown stronger with time. Even in the digital age, shape coding remains relevant. Touchscreen interfaces use haptic feedback to provide the tactile distinction that physical shapes once provided. Game controllers use different button shapes and textures to allow identification without looking. Smartphone apps incorporate gesture-based controls that map intuitively to their functions, following principles Chapanis established. The story also highlights the importance of listening to users rather than blaming them. The Army's initial response, more training, stricter procedures, harsher punishment, represented a common but ineffective approach to human error. Chapanis showed that understanding why errors occur is more productive than simply demanding they stop. This lesson remains relevant in fields from healthcare to nuclear power, where human error can have catastrophic consequences. Research in cognitive psychology has since explained why the B-17 control confusion was so persistent. Under stress, humans revert to automatic behaviors and muscle memory. The similar controls created what psychologists call negative transfer. Previous correct actions with one control led to incorrect actions with another. Chapanis's shape coding broke this negative transfer by making the controls distinctly different at the most basic sensory level. The international adoption of shape coding principles demonstrates how good ideas transcend national boundaries and conflicts. Even as they fought against American bombers, German engineers were incorporating shape coding principles discovered by Americans. Soviet designers, despite ideological opposition to capitalist innovations, embraced shape coding as scientifically sound. The principle that good design serves all humanity proved stronger than wartime divisions. Modern human factors engineers continue to discover applications for Chapanis's principles. In virtual reality interfaces, different controller shapes help users navigate complex virtual environments. In medical devices, shape coding prevents medication errors that could cost lives. In autonomous vehicles, manual override controls use distinctive shapes to ensure instant recognition in emergency situations. The B-17 modification also established important precedents for military procurement and design. After the success of shape coding, the military began requiring human factors analysis for all new equipment. Contracts included provisions for user testing and modification based on operator feedback. The recognition that equipment must be designed for real-world use conditions, not just theoretical specifications, became embedded in military procurement processes. Veterans organizations have ensured that the story of the B-17 modifications isn't forgotten. The 8th Air Force Historical Society maintains detailed records of the modification program and its impact. Surviving B-17s displayed in museums worldwide retain their shape-coded controls, with plaques explaining their significance. Tour guides tell visitors how those simple wheels and wedges saved countless lives. The last surviving B-17 combat veteran who flew with the original unmodified controls, Colonel Robert Morgan, pilot of the Memphis Belle, passed away in 2004. Before his death, he often spoke about the relief the modifications brought to bomber crews. "We had enough to worry about with fighters and flak," he said. "That little wheel meant one less thing that could go wrong, one less way to die." Contemporary designers facing complex interface challenges often return to Chapanis's simple question: what would make the right action obvious? This approach has influenced everything from industrial control rooms to smartphone apps. The principle that good design should reduce cognitive load rather than increase it guides modern user experience design across all fields. The B-17 story also demonstrates the value of rapid prototyping and field modification. Rather than waiting for perfect factory solutions, maintenance crews implemented crude but effective modifications immediately. This approach, now formalized in concepts like minimum viable product and agile development, showed that immediate imperfect solutions often beat delayed perfect ones. As we advance into an age of increasingly complex human-machine interfaces, from autonomous vehicles to artificial intelligence systems, Chapanis's principles become more relevant, not less. The need for intuitive, error-resistant design grows as our machines become more powerful, and their potential for catastrophic failure increases. The lesson that humans shouldn't have to adapt to poor design remains as true today as it was in 1942. The economic benefits of human factors engineering, first demonstrated by the B-17 modifications, have been validated repeatedly across industries. Companies that invest in user-centered design see fewer accidents, higher productivity, and greater user satisfaction. The return on investment Chapanis demonstrated, pennies spent to save millions, continues to justify human factors research and implementation. Educational programs worldwide now require engineers to study human factors as part of their core curriculum. The recognition that technical excellence means nothing if humans can't use the technology effectively has become fundamental to engineering education. The B-17 case is often the first example students encounter, demonstrating that even the best engineers can overlook critical human factors. The modification program also established important principles about blame and responsibility in system failures. The shift from blaming pilots to examining design flaws represented a fundamental change in how we think about human error. This perspective shift has influenced fields from aviation to healthcare, saving countless lives by focusing on system improvement rather than individual punishment. Modern accident investigation protocols, whether for aircraft crashes, industrial accidents, or medical errors, incorporate Chapanis's insights. Investigators look for design factors that might contribute to human error. They examine whether controls are distinguishable, whether procedures are intuitive, whether the system sets users up for success or failure. The question, what made the error possible, has become as important as who made the error. The legacy extends to consumer products we use every day. The shape of a car's gear shift, the texture of a power tool's trigger, the distinctive feel of a phone's power button, all reflect principles established by those first B-17 modifications. Manufacturers who ignore these principles often find their products failing in the market, not because they don't work, but because users can't operate them reliably. The story of Alphonse Chapanis and the B-17 controls ultimately teaches us that the best engineering serves human needs rather than demanding human perfection. It reminds us that simple solutions can solve complex problems, that observation can be more valuable than assumption, and that admitting design flaws is more productive than blaming users. These lessons, learned from bombers collapsing on runways in 1942, continue to guide design and save lives 8 decades later. As we face new challenges in human-machine interaction, from autonomous vehicles to artificial intelligence interfaces, we would do well to remember the young psychologist who solved a crisis not through complex technology or harsh discipline, but by adding simple rubber wheels to aluminum levers. His insight that machines should accommodate human nature rather than fight against it remains one of the most important principles in all of engineering. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its place in history as one of the most successful bombers of World War II. But perhaps its greatest contribution was serving as the catalyst for a revolution in human factors engineering that continues to save lives every day. Every time we correctly identify a control by touch, every time an error is prevented by good design, every time a machine works with rather than against human nature, we're experiencing the legacy of those simple modifications first implemented in the dark days of 1942. The next time you fly in an aircraft and notice the different shapes of the controls, remember that those shapes exist because a young psychologist named Alphonse Chapanis sat in a cold B-17 cockpit and asked a simple question. Why do experienced pilots keep making the same mistake? His answer, that the mistake was in the design, not the pilot, changed not just aviation, but our entire relationship with technology. It established the principle that good design makes the right action the easy action, a principle that continues to guide engineers and designers in creating a safer, more usable world. This story, born from tragedy on American runways in 1942, stands as testament to the power of human-centered design and the profound impact that simple solutions can have on complex problems. The rubber wheels and aluminum wedges attached to B-17 controls may seem trivial in retrospect, but they represented a fundamental shift in how we think about the relationship between humans and machines. A shift that continues to save lives and prevent accidents every single day, in every corner of our increasingly technological world.